Hello, this is Benjamin Boyce, and welcome to the Voice of Reason podcast. Today's guest is Cedrick Simmons, who is a doctorate fellow, or somebody who's working on his dissertation, and he's also an instructor. His investigations, or his dissertation, is on class and race and diversity training, and he brings a lot of knowledge into the ways in which diversity training is not only not working at what it's intended to do, it's actually cementing certain power structures that it's nominally trying to dismantle or upset. His is a Marxist/socialist lens, and I actually really appreciate it. And I rather appreciated gaining his insight or his perspective into these matters. It really does shed a lot of light onto my research into the Evergreen State College, because we do talk not only about the corporate environment, but the ways in which diversity, equity, and inclusion training and offices are kind of meddling with or affecting, let's just say, the collegiate and the educational environment. This was a very educational conversation for me as somebody who's been, looking at this stuff worrisomely for several years now, but now I have a different form of analysis, and I'm really excited to introduce you to Cedrick Simmons. How far away from your dissertation being dissertated are you?
Probably, if all else goes the way that I plan, it should be done by this time next year.
Oh, nice. Okay. And is that like a 2 or 3 year kind of thing, or how long?
Oh, this is my 6th year in grad school.
Whoa. Wait.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Wow.
I went for my master's. So right after undergrad, I got into a PhD program at Boston College, and so I got my master's and my PhD while in graduate school.
Okay. Yeah.
Combined. Yep.
And is it breaking you, or are you bigger than it? I hear the doctorate can crack
it's
people.
It's breaking me.
Yeah.
It broke me, and I think since I moved to back home to Rochester, New York last year to start doing my data collection in a cheaper area, because Boston's so much more expensive. And so I think over the last year, even though the world has gone to shit, I think...
What makes you say that?
COVID really... My dad got COVID, and so it really...
I'm sorry.
Yeah, he's fine now, but
okay.
It was rough. He was on life support. It was a mess. And so once that happened, just a series of unfortunate events have happened since. But the good thing is that I've been able to be home and be close to family when they needed me most. So
yeah. Well, there you go. Yeah. And what's your dissertation called, or was it on?
So right now, the tentative title is the Diversity Management Bargain. Race, class, and diversity or equity work in higher education.
Yeah, which is a pretty hot topic.
Yeah,
right now.
Yeah,
and it's been ramping up for several years. I've been following it, but right now it's kind of reached full consciousness, it seems like.
Yes, and books like White Fragility sort of help to usher that in, or to bring that to the fore, and obviously the protests.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good time to talk about it.
What's your methodology on how you're studying that? Like, what's your framework of pursuing this?
So I conducted interviews with 30 diversity managers from a variety of different campuses in New York State and Massachusetts, and I think the best way to make sense of my framework is I'm just an unapologetic anti-essentialist. Okay. And so I'm coming in with a sort of anti-essentialist lens, and also to bring in a class analysis of diversity management, because that's what's missing.
That's a sustained critique of the equity, inclusion, and diversity I guess, I don't know what you would call it. Is it like the movement or the ideology, or?
Yeah, it's probably, I've called it a regime. The diversity regime is one term that I've liked. Yeah.
I can dig regime. Could you define for myself and the viewer or the listener, what do you mean by anti-essentialist, and
Hmm.
Yeah.
So when I say anti-essentialist, I mean I am someone who um, rejects or begins with the premise that any notions that categories, these descriptive categories like race, gender, etc., that I reject the notion that these categories are what's the word? That they are commensurate with nature. So when people, for example, use terms like race or racial differences, what they typically talk about is like there are different types of human beings, and the different racial categories that we have actually denote some natural distinctions. And I believe that that is a fiction, and reject any attempts to reaffirm the notion that racial differences are natural.
Okay. There seems to be a certain rhetoric within anti-racist regime or the anti-racist regime that they start by rejecting the natural reality of race. They say it's a social construct, but then they go on and reify it until it becomes like this, all-consuming category.
Yeah, the dodge, the way that race has been um, re, re, uh, reaffirmed as a natural category or natural distinction is through the language of culture. Yeah. And so they would say we're not talking about natural differences, but we're talking about cultural distinctions. And for folks who have studied the ways in which race has been deployed since probably since the 30s, and has been usually tied to some notion that like there are different types of people, not by virtue of nature, but they have different norms, they have different values, and that makes them fundamentally different from other people. Mm-hmm. And so even if they're not saying it's natural, they are saying that it does denote something essential about groups of people.
Yeah, like the concept of whiteness or blackness being tools.
Yeah, when people use the language of whiteness to explain some type of outcomes, what that denotes is that there's something essential. There's something inherent about people that we categorize as white, that essential trait is what is causing whatever outcomes that they're talking about. And that I think that if you are, well, one, I usually don't know what they mean by whiteness because it ends up becoming a term that is all encompassing for a lot of different things. Yeah. So I'm not sure. I think it's doing too much work in general. But even putting aside that fact, it usually is what's the word? White supremacists tend to agree with the notion that there is an inherent whiteness that produces an outcome, and that's something that we should embrace.
And so what caused you to be anti-essentialist in your thinking? Did you see like the outcomes of that way of thinking, or did you find it distasteful like intuitively before you kind of decided to out and out reject it as a framework?
It was not, it wasn't intuitive, or it wasn't, how do I say this? It wasn't, it's not like early on I was like, I'm going to be an anti-essentialist or what have you. Yeah. But it was more so seeing how essentialist notions of race play out in practice, especially for the last 10 years, I've been on college campuses. And so seeing how sometimes essentialist notions of race and gender, seeing how that plays out in a way that actually is just not effective at actually addressing the problems that I agree that exists. Like I believe racism exists, but I fundamentally believe that embracing race as a category is not the way to address racism. So it's more of like I've seen how folks organize, and I've seen how folks talk about racism in a way that reaffirms race as an inherent good, and I've seen that it just doesn't work.
Okay. And in what ways does it not work?
So for me, I there was a time where I was a part of an anti-racist student organization that was working with a bunch of other anti-racist organizations in the broader Boston area. And I was also part of a union at the same time, and a graduate student union. And so it was a great time to sort of do a comparison of like, okay, so what happens when you organize around similar interests with the union versus you organize around common identity or common experiences. Okay. And the big thing that, or the most, when I say that it doesn't work, part of what was clear for me is that when we embrace a sort of the notion that you can organize around a racial identity or common experience, what tends to happen is that the folks who come from wealthier backgrounds, folks with more status, folks with more wealth, folks with more power, essentially, that they end up becoming the ones who get to determine what is good or what works for the rest of the folks within that category. So if we're talking about race, the folks who tend to define what the appropriate remedies are, or even what the problem is, that tends to be wealthier, more powerful Black folks, and it almost never actually does anything to address the material realities of poor and working Black folks like myself and like my family. Mm-hmm. Whereas a union was, one, it was seen as a lot more threatening to folks with power. Okay. And two, being able to organize around things that that actually addressed my life. Things like, hey, we need a living wage. Yeah. Hey, our healthcare should not be something that is up for debate every single semester or every single year. Like, those are the things that keep me and other folks in general alive. Yeah. And so it was just a matter of, with the union, even though we weren't successful in a lot of the projects that we were putting forth, it was just clear to me that, like, what matters to me most is that folks like myself, like my family, have the necessities to survive. And I didn't see how that would be accomplished through what I would call essentialist notions, or organizing around essentialist notions of race.
Okay. Yeah. And do you think there's water, and I'm bringing this up so we can move beyond it, but do you think that there's water and that the current regime of anti-racism is being embraced by institutions because it is non-threatening and actually entrenches the powerful or those who already hold power?
I firmly believe that institutions are embracing the sort of white fragilities of the world, the white fragility books, or the diversity trainers in particular, but more so just the language of I think they're embracing the sort of diversity trainings and some of the anti-racist rhetoric precisely because it's not threatening. Mm-hmm. And like I said in my piece, like, if I'm an employer, why wouldn't I want a trainer to come in or an educator to come in and tell my employees, tell the workers that the reason why you don't have the necessities of your life, or the reason why workplace conflict exists, is not because of exploitation. It's not because of practices and policies that are authorized by the employers. Instead, it's because white people and Black people can't get along. Well, if I'm a Black elite and I'm a white elite, that sounds good to me, because that means I don't have to give up anything. Mm-hmm.
So how do you imagine going forward with your research, or what is your plan of, I guess, attack or critique in order to kind of shake up this regime a little bit? What are some strats that you have?
Yeah, so right now I'm working with this caucus that's a subset of the Democratic of DSA. Democratic Socialists of America. Sorry, stutter sometimes.
So do I.
So the group is called Class Unity, and one of the main impetus of Class Unity, and the main reason why I joined Class Unity, is because it's a group of folks who were a part of DSA, and folks who are anti-essentialists who are trying to figure out, how do we answer that very question. And for me, one of the angles to go about this is to expose the ways in which essentialism or essentialist notions of race can be smuggled in through anti-racist or anti-discrimination discourse, and to show that the folks who are benefiting the most from this and the ones who are funding the most, who are putting the most funds into this, are executives. And so if it is going to actually serve the interest of poor and working African Americans and poor and working folks in general, then why would corporate executives be the ones who are funding this the most? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think folks, for a variety of different reasons, may not see that connection. And because I think there's a lot of folks who are genuinely recognizing that racism is a legitimate problem, folks who identify as white and like really want to be the solution. My issue, and I think my role, is to expose that the solutions that are being sold to them are actually just bullshit.
Okay. Why do you think that this particular form of bullshit is so attractive?
I think it's one reason why it's attractive is because if you have a lot of intellectuals and you have or a lot of educators, you have folks in human resource offices, and if you have folks, corporations that are all promoting the view that this logic of anti-racism is the way forward, then it's not surprising that it's going to end up being popular. If you look around and you have very little access to disconfirming evidence, then it's not surprising that folks are going to embrace this framework. And another reason why is because for the same reasons that I mentioned before about why corporate executives are promoting this, because it's not threatening. I think part of what this brand of anti-racism, this particular brand of anti-racism does, is it gives folks an easy way to do something, right? All I have to do is read a book. All I have to do is listen to this trainer speak to me for an hour, and that is far more attractive than doing things like changing the tax structure or doing it right. So I think it's one. And I guess the last part of that is since the Cold War, any type of class analysis has been so stigmatized and rejected and framed as quote unquote class reductionism or another form of racism that that any attempts to go beyond psychology and go beyond culture to talk about anti-racism is like there are consequences. You get labeled in certain ways. You get framed as you get framed as helping to support white supremacy or what have you. It's a really strange occurrence in the post-Cold War period that any attempts to bring a class analysis into conversation with an analysis of race and racism, that somehow that's viewed as a problem. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's why it's attractive.
Is a class analysis, does it have the same pitfalls as essentialism with regards to race? Do you essentialize, or how do you be anti-essentialist when you think of in terms of class?
Yeah, so one of the ways that folks talk about, or one of the most popular ways, at least in the United States, that people talk about race is that it's fundamentally, that even racism is fundamentally about who people are, that the problem is who people are and the solution is who people are. So, for example, in White Fragility, whenever she's asked, like, what are the next steps, or even by Jimmy Fallon, like, what should we do? First thing she says is people need to recognize that they're white. so it comes back to who they supposedly are. What a class analysis does is that it doesn't center some notion about the intrinsic properties of individuals, but instead it focuses on what people do and how do people reproduce themselves and how do people make a living. And so when I say, for example, I'm going to apply a class analysis to diversity management, to the diversity management industry or regime, part of what I mean is thinking about or talking about how diversity trainers are professionals who sell their labor and sell their expertise to corporate executives. And so as a result, that diversity trainer who goes in to sort of say, here's why inequality exists and here's what to do about it, they are not going to promote remedies, or they're not going to promote explanations that goes against the interests of their employer. It's, I guess another way of framing it is they are pretty similar to political appointees, right? They are, and so if a political appointee, like for example, the Attorney General Barr, Barr is not going to, for example, say that the problems that exist in the United States right now can be traced to Donald Trump. We know that he's not going to say Donald Trump's practices. They're not. He's not going to say that because that's his boss, and he was appointed for that position, and he is essentially an at-will employee. The same is true for diversity trainers, these consultants. And so so I think that applying a class analysis takes us away from this whole, we're trying to figure out who are the good and bad people, and instead saying what are in the interests of, for example, these diversity trainers, or what's in the material interests of folks in general, and how do they reproduce themselves. So whether or not you are able to reproduce yourselves by selling your labor or by appropriating value, or appropriating or exploiting those workers, like that is a pretty good way to determine and to explain what folks do.
Mm-hmm. The diversity, equity, inclusion regime is pretty advanced now. Do you know how many billions of dollars they make a year?
I don't know the precise number, but I know it's billions.
It's pretty big, and it's in major institutions, right? And corporations, and I mean, it captured schools. You think first? That was the first kind of
corporations, firms were the first. Yeah.
Okay. What kind of firms do you?
So from what I understand so far, diversity trainings became really popular right when Reagan was in office and was starting to gut affirmative action. And was pretty hostile, obviously, to affirmative action. And so you had these folks in these previous positions as affirmative action officers. There was a period where it was likely that they were going to lose their jobs, right? So if affirmative action is gutted, you don't need affirmative action officers. Mm-hmm. And so you had these affirmative action compliance officers that were working for various businesses. Their jobs were threatened. And one way to basically preserve the legitimacy of their work is to make sure they keep their salary, is to reframe their work in a way that serves the interests of their employer. And so if compliance doesn't serve their interests necessarily, another way to prove to an employer that you should keep your job is to say that this is going to help with the bottom line. And diversity trainings became popular because they supposedly help with boosting productivity, not because there was never proof that diversity trainings actually reduce racist practices. The reason why it became popular was because it was something that was appealing to executives, and the folks who were doing these trainings were saying that this is appealing because it's going to help to reduce workplace conflict. It's going to help to boost productivity, and it's going to be a really effective shield from discrimination lawsuits. So you can say that, look, we're actively preventing and addressing discrimination because we have these diversity trainings. But again, it's not because they had anything. It's not because there was evidence that these trainings actually reduce racist practices.
Do they?
No,
they don't. Is there any proof? Do they ever bring up proof? Because they don't sell themselves.
Yeah. So the only time
they would rather call that a effect of whiteness than actually.
I mean, the whole book, White Fragility, is basically a book that's trying to justify the reality that diversity trainings are not effective. And so, if I can say, for example, that my trainings are ineffective because white people just don't recognize they're white, then that sort of says that, the problem isn't the trainings, the problem is the subjects of the trainings, right? But the reality is that the studies that I've seen, and I've been looking for some time to find proof that they work, every time I find some type of study of the effectiveness of trainings, what it shows is that they're largely ineffective and they can actually activate bias.
How do they activate bias, or how have you seen?
So, for example, if I'm a trainer and most of the things that I'm talking about are about how Black people have a different culture, Black people have different needs, Black people have different beliefs that need to be recognized as distinctly different and treated as distinctly different. If I am racist and I'm being told that, yes, racial differences are basically inherent, then it's not surprising that I can actually reinforce some racist beliefs.
Mm-hmm. And what would you think would be the better counter for that? If we do need racial or anti-racist training in a workplace, like what is the proper way or the way that actually has results of diminishing difference between people or apparent difference?
Well, I think so. One study, and I can send it to you after, that attempted to answer this question. What they showed is participation in a union can actually be really effective at decreasing. Because you're organizing around common interests, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So if what's being centered is that if I am successful and you are successful in organizing for our common good as workers, instead of saying that here are the reasons why I am fundamentally different from you, then it stands to reason that it would likely reduce racial bias. So that was one of the first studies that I've seen, at least, that tried to determine whether or not unions could be effective. And what they showed is that, it can actually be really effective. And so I guess broadly speaking, I think organizing around common interests, the broader principle of organizing around common interests, recognizing those common interests and organizing around them for some type of collective good, I believe that is going to be far more effective. And I guess another way to answer that question is to say something that should not be controversial or should not be surprising, but it depends on where we're talking about. If we're talking about, for example, a police department, let's say in Minneapolis, the ways in which folks are able to be the perpetrators of racism and basically get away with it are very different than if we're talking about school teachers in a suburban district, right? And so the idea that both the explanations and the remedies for racist practices are the same, regardless of what institution we're talking about, regardless of what time we're talking about, regardless of what area or specific space that we're talking about. The notion that all those things should just be collapsed under this broad category of racism and anti-racism, I think I find that hard to believe. And so instead I would say it depends on where we're talking about. And I should say also, lastly, that if we're going to have some type of anti-discrimination trainings, I think it should be centered around, one, what actually is discrimination? Two, what are ways to basically not be racist in the particular workplace or that I am actually in. So if I'm a teacher, give me some skills or give me some tools of how to not be an asshole to my students, for example. All right, because I could be ignorant. It may very well just be that I am so ignorant because of where I grew up and how I've been socialized. But if I'm here and if I genuinely want to know how to not perpetrate racism, or basically not how to not treat my students unfairly, then the best way to go about that is to have a training or to have some knowledge of specific tangible practices that I can incorporate. Instead of giving me this overview of how all these problems exist because I won't recognize that I'm white. That doesn't give me anything.
Yeah. It does, but it's not real. It's like this false consciousness thing, or it kind of uploads it. It made me think about the difference between having your company form a softball team, like as a team sport, versus having them play a game of poker where they're all battling against each other so they can't see how much the house is taking in a way. And the diversity training is kind of pitting everybody against each other by holding, just playing this game of, cards and stuff like that, instead of rather having a common goal. The common goal, the example you gave would be a union, but there's other ways for teams to figure out how to work together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's at least to me, it's pretty clear that the ways, at least the Robin DiAngelo version of diversity training, what it authorizes is that there are no common interests and no basis for a common struggle amongst the workers because of their quote unquote racial identity. And what that obscures, to your point, or what that masks, is that the folks who are actually authorizing practices and policies in the workplace are the folks with the power, which are the executives. And from my experience and from what I've read and from what I've seen and participated in, one of the most common complaints from folks who actually do trainings is that the executives are never have to be a part of it. So the folks with the most power are not even in the room. Yeah. And so it shifts our attention from the practices and policies that are authorized by the employers, and also shifts our attention away from common interests in the ways that we as workers are similarly exploited. It shifts that responsibility and shifts that conversation from the executives to the workers and the problems that exist amongst those workers. And so it's a really effective way to manage dissent.
Yeah. But it seems to be the case that that form of exploitation that operates within the corporate or the business world is kind of, it's a different field when we're talking about education, or is it?
True. Well, it's different in the sense that I was talking with a brilliant scholar a few days ago about the fact that one of the issues that is coming to the forefront during this pandemic, as we get pushed back into our classes in a few weeks, is that faculty and teachers are workers. They sell their labor, and yet, especially in the academy, for at least for tenure track folks, or folks who have tenure, they don't see themselves as workers. They don't see themselves as laborers. And so I think that is one distinct difference, that in the academy, from what I've seen and from what I've read, even the notion of talking about a union for graduate students is viewed as illegitimate because we are not technically workers. Okay. We are. If you ask Boston College, we are framed as religious instructors as a way to justify. So we're not workers, even though we get paid to teach and to conduct research. They said that we were religious instructors because this is a religious institution. If I remember correctly, that was one of the claims made. And so I think that there are more ideological barriers to recognizing common class interests, and even discussing exploitation in educational institutions, from what I've seen, more so than there are in, for example, when I work as a waiter. Like I used to work part-time before COVID as a waiter, and there was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There was no misrecognition of where our paychecks come from, how we're screwed over by our bosses, and how managers help to basically keep us in line and to root the folks out who are trying to cause some trouble. Which for the bosses, it means that you are going to negatively impact their ability to maximize profit. Like those dynamics are pretty clear when you're working at a grocery store, when you're working at a corporation, and I would say also for the staff at schools. But when it comes to educators and even some grad students, for whatever reason, we do not have that recognition of those class distinctions.
Okay. It seems to be the case that there's more going on within education and the advancement of diversity than just a cover for the powers that be, and that this kind of is non-threatening for them. But it seems to be the case that a lot of students are demanding this. It seems like I have some evidence that certain sectors of academia are kind of planning this revolutionary tendency in order to perhaps gain more power or be able to control speech in that sense. Is that operating too? Have you looked at that?
Yeah,
any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So for my master's thesis, what I did was I conducted interviews, not with diversity managers, but a broad sample of administrators who work with students, essentially. So whether it be student affairs folks or academic affairs folks. And one of my findings was that those administrators are the ones who, when a student comes in and complains about like a clear-cut case of discrimination, that student doesn't say, I want diversity trainings, but they say, here's the problem. And I've been told that if I have problems, I'm supposed to go speak to an administrator. The administrator will say that the way to address this problem is to push for diversity trainings, or for you to be a diversity trainer yourself. So they'll tell students to do the same work as diversity trainers.
Okay.
They'll say, come up with a proposal. They'll say, come up with some educational materials that you could send to the president. And when you do that, make sure you don't ask for things that the president's going to say no to. So you can't ask for things that cost that much money. Instead, you should ask for things that we can do in-house, like a diversity training or affinity groups or what have you. So what that tells me is that one of the main constituencies that are promoting the view that if you are a victim of racism as a student, the way to go about it is to ask for more speech codes or to ask for more diversity trainings. What I'm finding is that it's the administrators whose responsibility is to develop student leadership, that they are one of the main constituencies who are promoting that. And why would they promote that? Because what that tends to show is one, or what it tends to provide for them is more access to power.
Yeah.
So then they'll be the ones who are on these committees. They'll be the ones who are on these bias response teams. And and secondly, if my job can be threatened because of students protesting or students demanding things that makes the president upset, whether it be just like even a protest that can negatively impact the reputation of the school, if I do a really good job at preventing that, then that's good for me. But if the students protest and demand those things that could actually be threatening to the higher ups, then my ass is on the line. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so that's the material interest, or that's their stake in promoting this particular brand of anti-racism. And I guess I'll add one last point to that is the expansion of this sort of student leadership or student affairs profession that occurred after the range of anti-war and anti-racism and civil rights protests that were happening in the 60s, where it was the student affairs folks who were their profession was a lot smaller at the time. And so when students were protesting, the president and the other executives were looking to the student affairs folks to play the middleman. They were basically asking them to say, for knowledge about what the students were doing, to sort of negotiate in between them. And since then, we've seen the student affairs profession expand. And as a result, their ability or their role as managers of potential and actual student dissent has expanded. And so it makes perfect sense that as they have more of a role in guiding or determining what students do and using things like the student codes of conduct as a way to sort of say, if you don't do this, then here are the consequences. Their ability to sort of determine how students respond to injustices on campus, as that has gone up, the calls for diversity trainings and speech codes have gone up.
Oh, okay. All right. So it's a self-reinforcing loop in a way.
Yes.
And there are charts that I've seen where it just kind of shows this dramatic increase in administration, and you've given some reasons for it, but also I've seen some parsings of that data that says that the influx of really cheap loans, just kind of the administration is the ones who kind of gobbled that up. And now you have like education is kind of the secondary thing that colleges even promote now. They don't even really promote that this is a place where you go and you learn. This is a place where you go and you live. This is about creating a home here. This is about like, we're going to make you feel like a king or a queen for like 4 years. Like this is your experience, right? Which kind of,
yeah.
It shifts the product of education to something else.
Yeah, so I would say the research on the expansion of administration and how this is tied to a huge decline in state or public financial support for colleges in general, which then led schools to have to rely more and more on private sources of revenue. So things like donations and also obviously tuition. That absolutely, how do I say this? That plays a role in shaping or motivating schools to basically reframe colleges and universities as these, for lack of a better word, I mean, especially the elites, they're basically, Yeah, right. I mean, like the best indicator of this was my advisor told me one day that made me laugh hysterically, but it also is really smart. Was that like if the main focus of colleges and universities, or the main priority of colleges and universities, was still education, then why is it that bookstores rarely sell books anymore? If you go to a bookstore, what they mainly sell is the clothes with the brand on it, and other what's it like electronics and stuff like that. Bookstores aren't really like bookstores anymore, and so that's a pretty good indication of this shift. I would also say that the history of colleges and universities, as far as what I know, it has never really been primarily or solely about education. It's mainly been these institutions have largely existed, from my understanding of the history, as a gateway for social mobility for professionals and the children of elites. Yeah. And so it's education in the sense that it's education for professionals and elites, but not sort of like education for the sake of education. Yeah. But to your point, as far as the expansion of the administration, there's this great book called The Fall of the Faculty that I would recommend to everyone. Okay. I can't remember which year it came out, but one of the explanations that they offer that I think is pretty persuasive is that as you have more and more administrators who are appointed by vice presidents or associate vice presidents, or what have you, they need to create some type of structure in place that justifies their existence. And so how do you do that? You say, I need to have more assistants. And then your job becomes managing those assistants. And so it almost resembles a pyramid scheme, to be honest. Well, yeah. Where
literally, that's what it is, basically, right?
Yeah, and to your point with the comparison of the expansion of administration versus faculty, my read on the ratio, or sorry, the ratio of administrators to students versus faculty to students, from what I've seen, the amount of faculty who full-time faculty are hired has largely been constant, but the ratio of administrators to students has grown a ton over the last 40 or so years. And so I do think that part of the reason has to do with the fact that, like, if you need to justify your existence as a manager, one of the ways that you do that is you hire more people to manage.
Yeah. Wow. It seems like it's headed towards a bubble. It seems like it can't sustain itself. Do you think that that's how is it going to play out going forward? Is it sustainable? Is what is going on sustainable?
I would say that COVID-19 is probably going to accelerate the time period over which that bubble bursts. But I think that primarily what's going to happen is so I don't think it's sustainable. One, I should say that, and I think one of the reasons why it's not sustainable is because of just the huge expansion in student debt. I believe it's been past $1 trillion in this country as far as how much debt the students owe. I think the more and more that students go into debt and aren't able to help sustain colleges and universities across the country while public dollars keeps going down, even during this pandemic, at least in New York State, I think that what's going to happen is that you're going to have less and less students deciding to go to these really expensive institutions, except for the really expensive, really elite ones who's like the Harvards and the Ivy Leagues, for example. Yeah. I think that they'll be fine for some time, but I think most of higher ed, I think that we should all be worried. And I think that this upcoming semester, when millions of folks have been unemployed or underemployed, and for what I can tell, and from every indication I could see, the $600 checks a week for unemployment, that's probably not going to be re-upped in the next week at least. Can you imagine that all those students, those hundreds of thousands of students of folks who have been unemployed or underemployed, when they go back to campus and they get that first or that second tuition bill and they can't pay for it and then their classes, a lot of them are online. And then you have all the anger and frustration for racism, but also for exploitation and inequality in general. When they all come back to campus and start saying, you know what, why am I paying so much for a college campus? Then it's going to be, I think it's going to cause a lot of schools to have to make some tough decisions, if not close. And if there isn't a massive expansion in public funding for higher education, I'm really terrified then of what's going to happen when that first or second tuition bill hits in that coming year.
Do you think that it would have been, or do you think that it's possible for an administration to reform itself? Like in your studying of how diversity is being used to, forward or cover for the exploitation of workers, or the way that it's being used to facilitate the expansion of this kind of weird bureaucratic class, is there any way for it to not just kind of just keep on growing until it collapses? Is there a way to pull it back from the trajectory?
So one thing I will add then, so not just a cover for exploitation, but it's also diversity trainings, for example, and all of the symbolic gestures of like these racial justice initiatives. What they're also covered for is for legit discrimination that occurs on their campus. Because when complaints occur, like I said previously, when the students come to administrators or come to faculty and say that this discrimination occurred, the folks who are handling it are usually administrators who are paid by the institution, and it's in their interest to make sure that you're not going to describe your problems or try to address your problems in a way that's threatening to the institution. And so, therefore, they're not going to promote the view that discrimination actually is a problem because it opens up the school for liability. Yeah. Right? You're going to be inviting a lawsuit. You're going to be inviting public press. And I think that's one of the reasons why people prefer to use the language of microaggressions. You can't be sued for microaggression. You can't be sued for discrimination. Right? So putting that piece aside, to answer your question of can administrators basically self-regulate in a way that will address the problem? I see no reason to believe that any group of professionals and managers will delegitimize their existence. I firmly believe that people tend to not want to come up with reasons why they should not be paid for a living. And so one mechanism, or I think there's two sort of changes that are probably a little bit more liberal, but something that is tangible in the short term that could sort of change the trajectory. Well, three. One is student protests and demonstrations with faculty and with staff. I think students, faculty, and staff organizing around common interests and doing things like saying, like, in general, administrators should not be controlling what is said and did in the classroom, right? Or controlling our hiring and promotional practices, right? Like, I think, and on top of that, doing things like, hey, maybe there should be some type of changes to the board of trustees, which no one ever talks about. But like, why is it that a group of elites, of rich corporate executives, get to determine policies and procedures on our campus? Why is it that we don't have something that actually looks like shared governance, where there are faculty and students who are determining or are collectively determining how things operate on the college campus? And I think that changes will occur once students, faculty, and staff organize around that I think that necessary change that needs to occur. Because again, in these discussions, the board of trustees are never discussed usually, and that's a problem. At least in discussions that I'm hearing, for example, about anti-racism, right? And so the second change is, I think, just like in preschools and other institutions that serve children or serve other people, like, one of the ways that you get the professionals and the managers and the executives to basically treat folks within that institution better is you have some type of external accountability, right? So, like, my partner works at my girlfriend works at a daycare, and so they have folks from the state who will come in and inspect and make sure that the school is abiding by the by state and legal or state and local policies, laws, and procedures. And so the threat of some type of regulators coming in without giving a heads up, that keeps them, or that motivates them to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, like keeping an appropriate ratio of students to teachers, for example. In higher ed, that's not really how accreditation works, right? Accreditation is not, we're going to have some inspectors come in to make sure that you're abiding by the policies and procedures. They don't come in to make sure that complaints about discrimination and harassment are handled appropriately. I would argue that it's not there's no real teeth behind it at all. And so I think that another mechanism is accreditation needs to be a lot more responsive to the needs and the interests and demands of faculty and students, and less reliant on these self-studies where schools get to say, here's how we are abiding with with state and local policy. And the last source, I think, is anti-discrimination in general legislation, or equal opportunity legislation, has largely how do we say it? The enforcement of anti-discrimination or equal opportunity laws has been weak since the inception. And so I think if there's going to be some type of motivation or pressure for administrations to change, I think it's going to have to come from accreditation. It's going to have to come from the state that says that, like, here are the actual ways that you could be compliant with these policies and procedures, and here's the ways you should be handling complaints. And these ways or these strategies that we promote are going to demonstrably serve the interests of the victims of racism and the victims of exploitation. And that's not the case right now.
What is the case right now in your estimation?
Right now, it's largely left up to schools to signal their compliance, usually symbolic, so like the websites or having some type of task force or committees, but they get to handle everything internally, essentially. And the other mechanism is for students or for faculty or workers to file a complaint and to possibly sue the institution. But obviously, due to the asymmetry of power and resources, the folks who tend to win those suits are the schools.
Yeah. What you've just told me over the last, 52 minutes is a complete analysis of one of my ongoing projects about a school that I attended in Olympia, Washington, called Evergreen State College. And in 2017, there was a huge intersectional meltdown. The campus was taken over. There's protests. There was hostage taking. There's community patrols with bats. It was just this crazy thing. The students live streamed it. It was a big, riotous kind of uprising or outburst. It's very similar to kind of what happened after COVID cooped us up for a while, and then everybody blew up about this persistent real issue of racism. But racism was just kind of, in a certain analysis, just a way for people to get their yayas out, and on a certain level, and the perpetual protests and the riots and like a lot of the energy that's being released. But the fallout of the protests at the Evergreen State College were basically, the only thing that actually changed was that the administration got more power. The students were appeased. They got more, equity space and more officers, but and they were allowed to tool around with the student code of conduct. But what happened was that the president of the college just hired more VPs, put in more structures, and diminished the ability even for the faculty to communicate with each other. He even stripped them of their ability to communicate with each other. And ultimately, this guy just gained more power under the cover of justice and a bright racial future. And just seeing you describe those mechanics operating completely across the country, but in higher ed in general, is really played out in the experiment that was the Evergreen State College.
Yeah, so I got a chance to look a little bit at what was taking place at Evergreen, and I should start by then saying that somebody who I think was a brilliant thinker, and somebody who encouraged me to be a little bit less cynical and focus a little bit more on solutions and working towards a common good with a collective is Michael Brooks. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Michael Brooks or the Michael Brooks Show. So I just want to say quickly that one, rest in peace, and I'm still torn up about it. And the reason why I bring that up is to sort of provide a preface for why I'm giving the answer that I'm giving. So I think that one of the ways to think about what took place from what I saw at Evergreen is to recognize that like there are two truths that seem to be in conflict with each other, but they're actually not. So the first truth is that the students who were protesting and complaining about racism could very well and probably likely would be complaining about legitimate cases of racism that took place on that campus, but maybe not on that campus, right? Like from what I find it hard to believe that folks will get so upset because of a problem that doesn't exist, but where the other what's the word? But the other piece of that puzzle that needs to be recognized with the empathy for like they're complaining for about legitimate problems, even if you disagree with the remedies, is that the administrators will use those opportunities to expand their power and to shift the direction, shift the attention, shift the anger to individual faculty, because it is in their interest to do so. It protects the institution. It basically makes particular individuals be the sort of fall guys or what have you. And so, and if you have administrators, at least the ones from like the ones I've seen in the past and the ones who I've studied, if they're saying, yeah, the faculty are the problem. The faculty are the problem. It's not the institution. It's not, and the way that you address it is like, you give me more power. They don't say it like that, but they say it like, the way you address it is you do what other schools have done. You do these things like have more, like call for another vice president, or demand that administrators will have control over the faculty hiring and promotional process. If the folks who are saying, I'm your ally, I'm your friend, if they are telling the students, here's the way to go about it, and if what they're seeing at other institutions, that's how students are going about it because the administrators are doing the same thing there, then it actually makes perfect sense that there's going to be a lot of conflict between the students and the faculty, while the administrators get to grab more power and get off the hook. And so I would say the way to handle that situation, or the way to think about that situation, is to say that, okay, two things could be true. There could be professors who are assholes. There could be true that there are professors who are racist. But it is also true that the remedies that are being put forth actually do not address that problem. What it actually does is it creates more problems whereby administrators have more power and more authority over how things operate on that campus. And how do we know that in the future they won't use those same speech codes or those same anti-bias policies to police the protesters? And I know that that's what would happen because that's what happened to me. They would use the language of justice and anti-bias or whatever to say that if you are protesting, then you are disrupting the educational mandate of the institution. You are making people feel bad. You are disrespecting folks, and that is not inclusive, and therefore you deserve some type of reprimand. That's what happens. And I have no reason to believe that administrators, that when they have more and more power, that they won't just use it against any dissent that poses a threat to the institution. That's what I would say to the folks if I was with them there.
How do you conceive of us as a nation going forward with the racial dialogue and finding amelioration and like a common goal, common humanity? What do you think we should be focusing on, or what do you wish we were talking about?
So I would sleep better at night if folks, one, began with the premise that we should all be anti-essentialists, that we should reject any notion that what matters is that politics begins and ends at who people are instead of what people do. Right. So that would be first. The second piece of that is I would sleep better at night if folks promoted solutions that were actually effective at addressing the needs and the interests of poor and working folks in this country, right? So, like, for example, the hostility to the Bernie Sanders campaign from folks who present themselves as woke present themselves as the champions for Black folks. The idea that something like Medicare for all would not demonstrably improve the lives of African Americans across the country and folks in general. The idea that that's somehow racist or somehow supporting white supremacy is foolishness. It is absolute foolishness. And instead, somehow the solution is diversity trainings. If I asked randomly 100 Black and brown folks who are poor and working, which would you rather, a training or healthcare or Medicare for all? I can tell you, I'm pretty sure that they would say that my immediate needs would be met with healthcare or with a jobs program. And so so all of that is to say that if we're going to be talking about solutions for whether it be discrimination or inequality in general, we should actually talk about the solutions that work and reject unapologetically reject solutions that will not work. Okay. And actually a step further is to figure out why the solutions that are ineffective, why are they being promoted by corporations, professionals, and managers? And the reason why is because it's not threatening to their interests. It's not threatening to their pocketbooks, right? Yeah. So having that recognition, I think is an important step. A third step is I cannot imagine how the problems of discrimination or exploitation would actually be addressed in a period where unions have been decimated so much. One of the things I learned at Boston College when I was a graduate student, or I still am, but when I was doing the work with the union and with the anti-racist group, one of the reasons why we started working together is because the union can actually support folks who are making claims or filing grievances about practices like discrimination or unjust practices like administrators using speech codes to suppress dissent. Why? Because those unions are made up of folks who are elected and paid for by us and not by the executives. And so who would I rather have? Would I have an advocate who is elected by me, is accountable by me, is paid for with some of the money that I provide to them? Would I want them to be my advocates for the collective, or would I want somebody who is an administrator who is paid for by the institution to protect the needs of the institution and they're an at-will employee? I guess I'm going to go with the person who I get to choose and the person who serves my interests, right? Yeah. So unions, I think that the more that we recognize just how powerful unions can actually be for protecting our interests as students and as faculty, I think the better we would be as far as pushing back at the encroachment of power and the encroachment of their own interests of the administrators and the board of trustees. I think that would be, if there was one thing that, like, if I could flip a switch and like this happened tomorrow, it would be that every single student, faculty, every working person in the country is able to be a part of the union. Okay.
How do you, I guess this is a perpetual problem for somebody who's advancing something that goes against the interests of those who are in power, but how do you get that message out if this diversity anti-racist stuff is not, it's not even a bone that are being thrown the people who want actual, justice or actual change in the life. It's like kind of a rubber bone for them to chew on, but it doesn't even have any nutrients.
No nutrients. Yep.
How do you re-implement, I guess one term, I'm not a Marxist, but one term is kind of class consciousness. How do you reify that conversation and kind of recenter the conversation on material needs and what people do, not what they are?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So one of the things that I've learned just in a little bit of time that I have been doing some of this work and have been learning a ton from Class Unity is that conversations and attempts to sort of build solidarity and build a sense of power amongst workers that centers on common interests, I think is just an incredibly effective tool that for folks who may get too cynical or have you, we may think that that's just not going to work. But like it actually is effective, at least from what I've seen. And I firmly believe that folks are pragmatic. And so I guess one of the barriers then is the belief that somehow attempts to recognize and organize around common material interests is somehow supporting racism or supporting white supremacy, I think that is one of those ideological barriers that we have to push back against. And one of the ways to push back against is to show, one, how the shit that these people are selling is just ineffective. Like, to show that, like, they're literally lying. Like, they may believe, actually, I shouldn't say the lying. They may believe that these trainings or what have you are effective or what have you, but to show that the evidence is clear that it's not effective. Mm-hmm. And to then provide folks with an alternative to say that a lot of the things that we take for granted in the workplace were not given to us by executives who just thought, I just want to treat my workers nice today, right? It was a response to pressure from organized workers. And so the idea then that somehow that attempts to figure out what those common interests are and attempts to build institutions that unapologetically serve the interests of poor and working folks. The idea that that's somehow that's supporting or uplifting white supremacy. I think that if you articulate that contradiction to folks who genuinely mean well, I think like they would tend to agree that, like, oh shit, that is bullshit. And at the end of the day, the reality is that the more that we organize around common interests, and the more that we demonstrate how this sort of race reductionist beliefs or these sort of idealistic psychobabble bullshit, the more that we demonstrate that actually does not help to change the distribution of power and resources, and instead to show how alternatives like unions could be that. I think the more that folks will start to make those decisions to shift their thinking and to shift their practices. And I with the group Class Unity that I'm a part of now, as somebody who's sort of new to the Marxist world, who has largely been steeped in critical race theory for some time. So I may not articulate it in the right way, but I genuinely believe that what folks are trying to do in Class Unity and what folks are trying to do in unions across the country and even in DSA more broadly, I generally think that we're trying to work to figure out the answer to that question. And I think that the election the candidacy, the campaign of Bernie Sanders, where somebody who identifies as a democratic socialist, the idea that he even had a shot is huge. It's a huge shift in the I hate this term, the Overton window in the last 50 years. And so I get my hope from the belief that the more we recognize common interests, the more that we demonstrate and build power to serve the interests of poor working folks and to be unapologetic about it, I think the better off we'll be.
Mm-hmm. Great. That sounds hopeful. There's a lot of work to do, though.
There's a lot of work.
Yeah. What are your? Are you publishing regularly? Do you have a resource that people can find your work, and do you have something planned for the future?
So right now I'm working on my book. So the manuscript, so my dissertation is going to end up being a book manuscript on diversity management that I mentioned earlier. And so that is taking up a lot of my time for the next year. But I would say the Class Unity, if you type in Class Unity DSA in Google, it should be one of the first things or the first thing that shows up, where I'll be writing and publishing stuff on there. And also my Twitter. I believe the tag is No More Racecraft. So whenever I write something, I'll be posted on there as well.
Excellent. Cedrick, thanks so much for your time. You have given me, you've given like my work, you've imported a whole bunch of information that's very useful on a number of different conversations that I've been having to kind of analyze it from a completely different point of view than I've been focusing on. I think it's very useful to think about it in terms of material, I've been looking at what the critical race theory anti-fragility does psychologically, but you're showing like who it serves, like behind the scenes, like the green curtain kind of take on it, which I don't think a lot of people, I think it's really beneficial for people to kind of think about it on that level.
Well, thank you, thank you. I should say that also thank you for having me on. As every student and faculty and even folks like yourself should know that like this is a work in progress, and so part of this work, this dialogue, is trying to work through some of these ideas on top of actually putting it in practice. And so, giving me the chance to be able to work this out and talk about it with you and to clarify some of the things like was really helpful. So I really appreciate it.
Excellent. Hopefully we can check back in when you're a little bit further down the road, and hopefully we'll see what happens with higher education come fall.
I'll come back anytime you want, especially in the next semester when things start to get a little rough. If you want to talk about it some more, I'm your man.
I think that'd be great. Well, you have a good afternoon. I'll talk to you later.
All right. Take care.
All right. Ciao. Congratulations for reaching the end of the podcast. If you enjoyed this product, consider donating to this channel via paypal.me/Benjamin Boyce or joining me on Patreon. Also follow me on Twitter at Benjamin A. Boyce. Have a good night.